It's a common theory that foreign aid leads to human development. So let's examine this theory through literacy rates and child mortality rates. First, let's start with literacy. On the y-axis, you'll see literacy rate, and on the x-axis, you'll see aid received per person. You'll see the sub-Saharan countries as well as the South Asian countries, which are commonly referred to as developing nations, start near the bottom in literacy rates, but are relatively high in foreign aid received. As you watch, there's a generally global upward trend in literacy rates, but aid stays in relatively the same category. Let's examine two countries, India and Egypt. In 1985, both countries had a 44% literacy rate. India received $2 per person in aid, and Egypt $35. We see they follow relatively the same upward trend in literacy. With aid, however, Egypt decreases significantly over time, with a peak at $107 per person in 1990, and drops to $12 per person by 2006. From 1990 to 2002, aid decreased from $107 per person to $19, but literacy rose 17%. India, while receiving only $1.60 per person in 1990 and the same amount in 2002, rose by 14%, only 3% less than Egypt. So we see more aid does not necessarily equal a higher literacy rate. Now let's look at child mortality. The y-axis is child mortality in deaths per 1,000. The x-axis is still aid per capita. When we start in 1960, we see a large clump of countries on the right with high aid and high child mortality, but a handful on the left with high child mortality and low aid. By 1965, all the countries are grouped together. The countries as a group then, as we will see, move down in child mortality, but spread out in terms of aid. You'll notice most of the sub-Saharan countries stay at the top in terms of child mortality and still receive a relatively large amount of aid. Let's look at three developing nations, Peru, Sudan, and Indonesia. All have relatively the same infant mortality rates in 1975, with Indonesia and Peru at 141 per 1,000 and Sudan at 148. Peru and Indonesia make significantly better improvements than Sudan in child mortality rates, but also receive noticeably less aid. Now let's examine closely. When we look more closely at it, by 2010, Indonesia reduces its infant mortality rate by 81% to 33 per 1,000 and never received more than $11 per person. Peru reduced its rate by 86% to 20 deaths per 1,000 and never received more than $28 per person. Sudan, on the other hand, while receiving anywhere from $4.4 per person to $62 per person, well over anything that Peru or Indonesia received, only reduced its infant mortality rate by 43.9% to 48 deaths per 1,000. While this is not to bash Sudan, but simply to show, like the literacy graph, that foreign aid does not directly relate to development.